Step score is stuck below 240 or even passing, and you're watching classmates study less and score higher, at barely above the passing line, who desperately wanted to match into ophthalmology. We didn't add more UWorld passes, instead, we cut study habits that were bleeding her time and her energy. She scored 20 points higher and matched into Harvard ophthalmology. In this video, I'm showing you the 6 study habits to stop, because the students that are breaking 250, 260, or even 270 aren't grinding harder, they just stop doing what doesn't work. Habit number 1 is to stop memorizing and instead understand the pathophysiology. The first habit killing your score is trying to memorize everything instead of trying to understand why. Most students treat step exams like some of their undergraduate finals. Maybe there's just a lot of memorization. The issue with this is that you end up with 10 disconnected facts about things like epidural versus subdural hematomas. Memorization feels really fast. However, in the long run, it ends up being the slowest and least efficient way to prepare for any USMLE or shelf exam. The reason for this is that the NBMEs test you on the application of knowledge, not on the recall of random factoids. The issue is that when the NBME tests you on something that's slightly different, when the test writers are using a concept but showing you different details than maybe you've seen before, you are gonna get stuck. Let me give you a simple example with epidural versus subdural hematomas. These are classic step 1, step 2, and shelf questions. What I started to do when I first learned these things was the traditional memorization approach. I memorized that the epidural hematomas were from a middle meningeal artery bleed, that they were a relatively fast progression, there may be a lucid period, they were a little bit brighter on the CT, maybe lens-shaped, and it often happened from some sort of head trauma. For subdural hematomas, I memorized that it was from the bleeding of the bridging veins, that it was a slower progression. Maybe it was an older person that fell, darker on CT, crescent-shaped, and happened in people that had smaller brains. That's more than 10 separate facts that you're trying to keep straight in your head. The issue is that when the stakes are high, and when the timer is on, it's very difficult to recall these, especially when I need to answer a question in under 90 seconds. So instead of trying to memorize 10 things, instead try to figure out how, with only 1 or 2 concepts, I can explain the same number. Let's see what the pathophysiology approach would look like. Let's start with 1 core concept. The idea here is that one of these, the epidural hematoma, bleeding from a high pressure system. This is the middle meningeal artery bleed. On the other hand, we've got a subdural hematoma, which is coming from a low pressure bleed, right? This is the bridging veins, right? Veins are lower pressure. If all I remember is that the epidural comes from an arterial bleed, then everything else can pretty much make sense. The arteries are a high pressure system. What that means is that they need thick walls in order to withstand that pressure from all of those arterial pulsations that are happening at high pressure. This also means that arteries are harder to rupture, but that when they do, that blood is gonna come out really fast, which again makes sense that the progression would be that much faster. Faster bleeding means symptoms appear more quickly, and it means that on a CT scan, you're going to have brighter blood because there's going to be a lot more fresh iron that hasn't broken down yet or been cleaned up, that's going to then block the x-rays from getting through the tissue. The key though is that it's a high pressure system, and therefore everything is pretty much going to be faster. And I'm going to need a lot more direct trauma to that system in order to cause bleeding to start in the first place. Now let's take the subdural hematoma. The subdural hematoma comes from veins, right? And veins are a lower pressure system. Because veins need to withstand much lower pressures, they don't need to have as thick of walls, and so therefore they are much thinner, and thus for easier to shear or to rupture based off of movement. This is why for people with smaller brains relative to the size of their skull, like alcoholics, like people that have dementia, there is a easier chance that they're going to develop a subdural hematoma. This also means that because it's a venous bleed, it's going to be a slower bleed, which means the symptoms develop more slowly, or they might not even develop in a noticeable way at all. And it also means that they're going to be darker on CT because the blood is oftentimes going to be not as fresh because, again, you're going to have seen this blood accumulate over a much longer period of time. So because I used 1 principle to explain all of those different signs and symptoms, now I don't need to memorize 10 or more facts. Instead, all I need to do is just remember that 1 simple mechanism. Plus, if they ask you something that you didn't study specifically, for example, which is more common in elderly patients, you can reason it out. A subdural hematoma is going to have more stretching of the bridging veins because someone who's older, typically you're going to have at least some brain atrophy. And so in the elderly, you're going to have a greater chance of this, and therefore you're going to be able to reason through why someone that is elderly is more likely to have a subdural hematoma, especially as they're getting older. Understanding one mechanism now unlocks dozens of questions, and not only will it make it easier to learn new facts, but it'll also make it easier to remember and use those facts in high-pressure situations on exams. And this doesn't just work for neuro. This works for pretty much everything, including cardiovascular, renal, or pharmacology, right? So in pharmacology, instead of memorizing drug side effects, if you understand the mechanism and you can tie that mechanism to the side effects or mechanism to the uses, it now becomes so much easier to recall and to use, not just for exams, but also in your clinical practice. Same thing. Instead of trying to memorize symptoms, instead try to understand the pathophysiology and tie all of these things together. However, understanding alone isn't enough if you're using the wrong resources in the wrong ways. This gets us to habit number 2, which is to stop focusing on what resources to use, instead focus on how to use them. One of the most common pieces of advice that I hear is just do more UWorld questions and read more first aid, right? Students are constantly asking, what Anki deck should I use? Which QBank? What video sources? The issue is that they oftentimes feel that there's some sort of magic resource that they're missing. The brutal truth is that everyone that's scoring 250, 260, or 270 is using pretty much the same stuff that you are, and oftentimes they're using even fewer resources and they've been studying for less time. Now, before I get into the evidence of why it makes sense to focus on how as opposed to what, I want to talk about how we get into this trap in the first place. Oftentimes what I see is that people say something like, oh, I'm just a bad test taker. I've always struggled on standardized tests. My SATs were kind of okay, my MCAT was maybe kind of so-so, and the problem has just continued, and if anything, it's gotten worse during my USMLEs and or my shelf exams. Henry Ford said something like, whether you believe you can or whether you believe that you can't, you're going to be right either way. Test taking in many ways is the same thing. If I think that I'm a bad test taker, then oftentimes I'm going to end up taking actions that are going to lead me to have bad results, which are going to reinforce the belief that I'm a bad test taker in the first place. Instead, let's assume that test taking is actually a set of skills that can be learned. If I have bad test taking skills, I will have bad results. And if I have bad results, then because belief and identity are oftentimes tied to our experiences, if I have bad results, then I'm going to believe that maybe I'm just not a good test taker. I'm going to start to have more test taking anxiety. Now, is it because I'm a bad test taker, or is it because I just have bad skills? So if I think that I'm a bad test taker and that there's something wrong with me about my test taking abilities, then I'm going to look outside of myself. And so it makes total sense why people are constantly looking for outside resources and trying to ask their friends like, oh, because they'll notice that something is different. They'll see that their friends who are scoring higher, they're studying less, and they're using even fewer resources. And so they start to think like, well, I don't know, maybe there's something different about the resources that they're actually using. In reality, if it were just about the resources that they were using, then the struggling students, right, who are oftentimes studying more hours and they bought more courses and more books and more everything, the struggling students should actually end up doing better because they have been using more resources for longer. Because let's be honest, everyone that scores a 260 on step 2 and everyone that scores a 160 on step 2 are pretty much using more or less the same resources, right? They're all using roughly the same QBanks. Oftentimes they're using very similar books and they're using very similar sorts of computer programs. So how do I know that it's not just that some people are just really good at tests and some people just suck at tests? The reason is that I have actually worked with tons of students who they started out as being bad test takers, and all we did was to show them how to improve their skills. And after they improved their skills, they used the exact same resources and they did substantially better. So for example, there was one student I remember who he was so depressed because he had failed step 1. He could not get out of bed. He had really severe ADHD, some mild dyslexia, and he had severe depression. And so it was so bad that his mom actually had to drag him to the consultation itself because he was just so depressed and couldn't get out of bed. So what we did is we worked together to change the way that he used his resources, right? It was the exact same resources that he was using, but we just changed the way that he did it. So instead of memorizing things, he actually spent time understanding it and connecting it. Instead of using Anki just to cram stuff, he actually used it to retain information for a longer period of time. And instead of just reading a bunch of random questions and hoping that magically his score would go up, we taught him how to actually read questions in a proper way, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. In a pretty short period of time, he went from having failed his test to 2 months later scoring a 92%, which is, again, the top 3%, even before step 1 went pass fail, the top 3% in less than 2 months. This was the same person using the exact same resources and in less time than he studied originally scored substantially higher. Now, if it was true that he was a bad test taker, that would be impossible. If it had to be the resources, then you would look at that and say, oh, okay, well, I don't understand how he used pretty much the exact same resources that he was using before, right? The exact same QBank, he was using the same first aid. How is it that he was able to score so much better in less time? The answer is that he just changed his approach. So what does this mean for you if you want to score higher and you're stuck and you don't know why? Instead of saying, hey, what resources are you using? Ask them a follow-up question, which is to say, how are you using those resources? What exactly are you doing with them? When you get a question wrong, what are you doing to review the question? When you are reading a question, how is it that exactly you are reading the question? And if you want to learn one of the most important how differences, then be sure to understand habit number 3, which is stop reading the last sentence first. Reading the last sentence first sounds really, really efficient, but it's actually costing you points, and I'm about to prove why. So I understand why people do this. There are many exams for which it pays to know what the question is before you answer the question. So for things like the SATs or the ACTs, they're known as single-step questions where you only have to make a single jump in reasoning in order to answer the question. So for example, if I'm doing a reading passage on the SATs and I know that the question is asking something about what's the tone in the passage, then I know to go back and look for the tone. Especially for people that are struggling with timing, they think that they can shave minutes off of their blocks just by trying to skip some of the steps in terms of reading the question. Now, let me tell you why it doesn't work. Let's take, for example, Step 2 or shelf exams. According to the people who write the exam, the National Board of Medical Examiners, up to 50% of the questions on Step 2 are diagnosis questions, and up to 40% of the questions on Step 2 are management questions. That means that up to 90% of the time, it's either going to be diagnosis or management. Now, let me ask you, if you knew going into a question, if it was going to be, oh, this is going to be a diagnosis question, or, oh, this is going to be a management question, how useful would that really be to you? And would it be worth that time for you to sit there and read the question and the answers before you actually read the question itself? The answer is that it's probably not going to help you much at all, and that time would be better spent doing something else. So for example, let's say that I knew that it was a management question. If I knew it was a management question, I still need to know the diagnosis. Why? Because to answer any management question, you have to know both the diagnosis and you also have to know the severity, right? So knowing that it's one of the 40% of questions that is a management question, it doesn't really help me that much. Guess what? You need to know the diagnosis. Is that helpful for you to understand before you end up reading the question? Probably not. So what should we do with that time that we were spending reading the last sentence first? Well, first, you should read the vignette in the actual order in which it's presented, building the clinical picture as you go. You have to give your brain time to assemble it. And again, we're going to talk about this more in one of the future habits, but you need to think of how the demographics and the presenting symptoms and the timeline and the physical exam and everything else is going to fit together. That way, by the time that you hit the actual question itself, you should already have a differential and the answer should make a lot more sense. And while you're reading through the vignette chronologically, don't fall into this next trap, which is habit number 4, stop scanning for buzzwords and instead connect the clinical picture. So I was super guilty of this when I first started studying for the USMLEs. I would skim around quickly and hope that one of the words would jump out. I was hoping to see the things like boot-shaped heart and think, oh, this is tetralogy Fallot. I was always looking for that pathomnemonic finding that would give everything else away. The problem is that I was hunting for a shortcut that didn't exist. Let me explain why hunting for buzzwords is bound to fail. This is what I call the pathognomonic myth. There are very few signs or symptoms that are actually diagnostic by themselves. Let's take, for example, troponins in an MI. Even troponins are not diagnostic for an MI alone, right? In other words, if I see troponins elevated in the serum, that does not mean that it must be an MI. ST elevations, which again are relatively specific for an MI, even those aren't diagnostic for an MI. And chest pain definitely isn't diagnostic for an MI by itself, right? Remember, almost nothing in medicine is pathognomonic, and especially for exams like shelf exams and Step 2, they're not going to give you that one buzzword that's going to tell you exactly what the answer is. And if they are giving you a buzzword, oftentimes it's going to be a buzzword that is meant to kind of lead you in the wrong direction, right? So chest pain, not specific for MI. ST elevations, not specific for MI. Elevated troponins, not specific for MI. However, chest pain and ST elevations and troponins and with the right risk factors, that's a STEMI. Remember, diagnosis is about patterns, not finding single findings. So if you're not going to be searching for buzzwords, what should you be doing instead? Instead, you need to make sure that you read each sentence and build a bigger picture. After every single sentence, ask yourself, what does this mean in context? Or in other words, what does this sentence mean relative to the others? As you go through the vignette, you're going to want to build a differential diagnosis based off of how all the sentences fit together. Now, granted, this is not an easy thing to do, so it is something that you're going to want to practice. However, with persistence, you will find that you will be able to come up with 2 to 3 relatively accurate diagnoses in your head consistently after only a sentence or 2. Then, once you're reading questions the right way, you need to make sure that your Anki strategy isn't undermining everything. This brings us to habit number 5, stop doing Anki without understanding what it is that you're studying first. Now, this is one of the most frustrating parts about Anki, is that Anki is incredible for retention. I literally have done Anki pretty much every day for the last, 16 years. And it only takes me about 20 minutes a day of studying in order to remember everything that I've put into my cards over that period of time. Now, while Anki is incredible for remembering stuff, it is, in my opinion, terrible for learning. Anki reinforces what it is that you know, but it doesn't teach you what it is that you don't already know. So why does this matter? Anki, which is based on spaced repetition, is great for keeping facts fresh. It will prevent you forgetting things over time, and it's very, very efficient for review. However, if you're trying to use Anki to learn things, it can oftentimes backfire. I remember when I downloaded one of the pre-made decks when I was first or second year at Stanford, and I found that the cards were just so disconnected from each other. I was constantly having to just memorize words on a page, and I would oftentimes memorize like the placement of the word, or it would be like a closed deletion card, which frankly, I don't find very helpful at all. And I would remember that, oh yeah, those like blue dots are in the top left when I'm using my phone, and the answer was going to be diabetes. But because there was no context, there was no relationships between the different ideas, I ended up just getting all these random factoids with no framework. And when I got to doing questions, it was a disaster. Oftentimes we talk to people who have tried Anki in the past, which really just means that they've tried a lot of pre-made cards, and they think, I'm not an Anki person, or Anki just doesn't work for me. The issue is that they never understood it in the first place. They were just memorizing everything, right? Habit number 1. And they were trying to learn everything from cards, which isn't a very good way to do it in the first place. So then what those people do is they think, okay, well, I'm just gonna do videos. And so videos, in contrast, are great for learning, right? Because oftentimes if you can find good lectures, you can see the connections, you can see the why, you can see the pathophysiologic concepts that are underlying those ideas. The issue is that it's really passive, and it's really, really bad for retention. Because at least for me, I will forget a video not even within days. It will sometimes be within hours if I'm not reinforcing it. So what is the right way to use Anki? The right way to use Anki is that you want to first understand the material and then make cards. So you might do something like watch videos, read something like first aid, but try to connect the information before you start to make cards. Especially if you can build a mental model, it becomes so much easier to use something like spaced repetition to reinforce it because you've already learned the material and you don't have to rely on cards to make those connections in the first place. Now that you have the understanding and you have the cards, Anki is going to be your best friend because it's going to help you to retain all of that information that you worked so hard to acquire. And I understand. The reason why I started using Anki, using pre-made cards when I first started, was I thought, oh man, it's taking me so long to do Anki cards. Oh, it's taking me so long to make all of these flashcards, and wouldn't it be so much more of a time saver if I could just cut out all that time making cards and just spend all of my time reviewing them and learning them from the cards? Just like we said, Anki is pretty bad for learning new information. And in addition to that, most of the pre-made cards out there are just memorization in the first place. This is why in our coaching program, we start with the videos first and then give Anki cards second, so that you can learn the material first from the videos, and then afterwards, we've already made cards for those lectures so that you can use it to retain that information. If you're doing this on your own, the best way to do this is to make sure that you understand it first and then you make cards on the way as you go. And even with the perfect study approach, you'll sabotage yourself if you don't get this next timeline piece correct. This brings us to habit number 6, stop giving yourself too little time to study. Cramming your prep into an impossible timeline is pretty much guaranteeing that you're going to cut corners and underperform. Let's talk about why it's a problem to have too short of a timeline. We see this a lot where someone comes to us and they say, I want to get a 260 and I am currently below passing on my NBMEs and I've only got 2 weeks, right? This is somewhat of an extreme example, right? But it happens. And all of us have some version of this, where we're trying to rush to get to where it is that we want to go. The problem is that when we rush, we end up getting overwhelmed almost from the start. And when we get overwhelmed and are rushing, we're going to start cutting corners. Things like, I'm just gonna skip this section, or oh, I don't have time to go in depth on this. I'm just gonna skim this. I need to cover all of these questions, I just don't have time to slow down. The consequence of this is that you're going to rush through UWorld without doing any sort of proper review, you're gonna do Anki without having any sort of understanding, and you're never going to spend the time to actually learn it, and you're just going to have a very surface, memorization heavy coverage of the topics. When you're racing the clock, you study worse, not harder. Anxiety is also an inevitable consequence of having too little time. So if you find yourself in a constant panic, feeling like you don't have enough time, every day feels like you're falling further and further behind, and you start making desperate decisions like buying random resources or switching strategies midstream when you see your friend doing this new sort of technique, or you see this Reddit post and you're like, oh man, I guess I'm gonna try that. These are all signs that you probably haven't been giving yourself enough time. And as a consequence, your score probably isn't going to improve much, if at all, and sometimes it can even get worse. Now, let's be clear, the opposite extreme also exists. There are people out there who also give themselves no timeline at all. This also doesn't work because, like Parkinson's law states, the amount of time that something takes for us to accomplish a given task will either expand or shrink to fit the time allotted. Now, granted, it might sound like I'm arguing for setting the shortest timeline possible, but that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that if you give yourself way too much time, then there's going to be nothing that's going to force you to actually sit down and do the work in the present. So for example, if a friend asks me to hang out, then I'm probably gonna go because I've got plenty of time. My test is gonna be in, I don't know when. I'm going to lack that urgency. I'm gonna lack that focus. And without pressure, I'm gonna end up drifting. So what is the Goldilocks timeline? The one that's not too much, not too little, that's just right. What you're aiming for is that you want to have long enough in order to cover everything that you need to properly. But you also want to make sure that it's short enough that you feel productive pressure and that you're not going to tip too much into the panic mode. Remember, you should feel focused, not frantic. So how do you know if your timeline is right? You should feel that you have enough time to understand before memorizing. You also should be able to have enough time to do reviews of your practice questions properly, reviewing incorrects thoroughly, right? You should feel stretched. You should feel like, oh my gosh, I didn't quite accomplish everything that I wanted to do, but not end the day thinking like, oh my gosh, I got like nothing accomplished. I don't know how I'm going to end up getting to my target date when I want to take my test. You should also be able to see yourself making consistent progress, not just in the blocks that you're doing, but also in terms of the NBMEs that you're taking. Now, obviously everyone's situation is a little different, so I'm a little hesitant to tell you exactly how much time something should take. The rough guideline that I would give is that you should expect, if you're studying well and full-time and efficiently, then you should expect to improve your score for step 1 by about 5% every month. And you should expect to score about 10 points higher for step 2 every month. Again, this is with full-time, efficient, effective study. So let's say that I'm at a 200 for step 2 and I want to get to 260. I might give myself 6 months in order to get to that score. And if I'm at a 45% on step 1 and I want to get to, say, a 60%, or let's say probably 70% to be safe, I should probably give myself about 5 months to study. So let's recap the 6 habits to stop. Number 1, stop memorizing and understand the pathophysiology. Number 2, stop focusing on what resources you use, instead focus on how you use them. Number 3, stop reading the last sentence first. Number 4, stop scanning for buzzwords and instead build a clinical picture. Number 5, stop doing Anki without an understanding first. And number 6, stop giving yourself too little time to study. And remember that student that I mentioned in the beginning, the one that matched into Harvard ophthalmology? She didn't add anything. She actually just cut these exact habits, and she saw a 20-point improvement in about a couple weeks. Your score isn't stuck because you're not doing enough, it's stuck because you're doing the wrong things. Cut these 6 habits and you could be shocked at how fast things can change. Now let me answer some of the most common questions that I get about these exact strategies. The first is, how do I know if I actually understand something versus I've just memorized it? This is a good question. This is actually one of the hardest things I think someone can learn, which is like, how do you actually learn something well? As opposed to, if I've memorized things for my entire life, like how do I actually know? I like to use the Feynman technique, which is you should be able to explain it to an intelligent 3rd or 4th grader, meaning you should be able to strip out all of the fancy words and all of the details and instead really just spend time explaining it. So I'll give you an example. There was a student that I knew who had failed step 1. She was constantly seeing that her score was just like stuck. I didn't understand because she was smart, she was very accomplished, she was very hardworking, and yet she was still failing her exams. I was surprised until I asked her to explain to me, wait a minute, tell me more about something that you just studied. And so she was telling me about pericarditis. And what she immediately started telling me was how many milliliters of fluid would be in the pericardial sac before you would start to get tamponade. And I was like, wait a minute, wait, what? Like, can you actually explain what tamponade is? And she's like, well, tamponade, if you've got, 300 cc's of fluid that's accumulated, then it's going to cause, it's like, no, like what exactly is tamponade? Well, tamponade, it's like, no, actually explain to me in really simple terms what is tamponade. And she was like, oh, well, I don't know. And so what you want to do is you want to force yourself to actually, instead of reciting facts, which is what a lot of people are used to, is actually simplify it down so that you can explain it to someone at a very, very basic level. If you can do that, so especially with someone who doesn't know a lot about medicine, if you can explain it in really, really simple terms, then there's a good chance that you understand it as opposed to you've just memorized it. The second question is, what if I'm already short on time? Should I still slow down to understand things first? They say slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And so one of the things that I found is that people that tend to rush, they're doing it because they want to get the highest improvement in their scores. And so they rush thinking that by trying to cover more material, they're going to get a higher score faster. What I've actually found is the opposite is true. The people that slow down and they actually say, okay, you know what? I don't care when I take my test. I just want to make sure that everything that I learn it well. I have a system so they never forget it. And I'm going to learn this system for how it is that I'm going to understand and read questions so that I don't get stuck between two answer choices and I'm constantly choosing wrong. Those people, ironically, are the ones that improve their score the fastest, right? So that student I talked about earlier who went from failing, he couldn't get out of bed, his mom dragged him to the consultation. He ended up scoring a 92% in 2 months, but he'd actually given himself much longer to prepare. And so what happened is that because he was slowing down, he was understanding it. Because he was understanding it, he would see his scores go up pretty quickly. And because he was seeing his scores go up pretty quickly, he was feeling a lot more motivated. And that motivation was the thing that allowed him to study even more and what ultimately allowed him to take his test much sooner than he'd originally planned, right? So even if you're short on time, I would actually say that that's the best time for you to study more slowly, because if you only learn, like, let's say that you've got only a few months, and let's say that you heaven forbid, you only covered, say, 20 or 30% of the material on the exam. If you could get, say, like a 10 or a 20-point improvement in that time, but only study 20 or 30%, that's actually not bad, because as long as the things that increased your score were the things that you studied, then the next step is really obvious, right? I can just study another few months and study another 20 or 30%, and I should expect to get probably a pretty similar improvement in my score. On the flip side, what I oftentimes see is that someone's like, well, I'm 40 points away from where it is that I want to be, and I've only got a month left. Let's try and cover everything that I would think that I would need to do in order to get a 40-point improvement and only do it in 4 weeks. The issue with that is that you're going to have such a superficial understanding of it that by the time that you finish those 4 weeks, it's not going to be really much of anything to help you to improve your score. And so you're gonna have to go back and redo it all again, and you're gonna have to start basically from ground zero. Whereas if you just do it slowly, and even if you learn a small amount, but you learn that thing so well, and you have a good system so you can retain it, you're never gonna have to go back and review that again. You can just continue to study the material in the way that improved your score in the first place. The third question is, how do I break the habit of scanning for buzzwords when I've been doing it forever? This is a great question. In general, if you want to improve a skill, you have to take that skill and you have to break it down into smaller skills. So for example, when I learned how to serve in tennis, the instructors, instead of just having us serve a bunch of tennis balls, instead they broke down the serving mechanics into 3 or 4 different motions, and then they just had us break down and practice each of those motions. So remember the first afternoon or 2 at the tennis camp that I was in, all I did was take a tennis ball and throw it up in the air and just catch it, and just practice that literally all day. And then after that, they took the next skill, which was like, how does you position your racket when you're throwing the tennis ball up in the air? And we just practiced that for a bit. And then we practiced bringing the tennis racket down on the ball, right? And eventually we put it all together. So if you want to break a habit of scanning for buzzwords, what you need to do is that you need to break down the exact habits of question interpretation into the individual components and work on those. And so be sure to stick around until the end, because I've got another suggestion for how it is that you can improve your question interpretation. So there you have it, the 6 habits holding your STEP score hostage. Your score isn't stuck because you're not smart enough, it's stuck because you're doing the wrong things. Now, cutting these habits is step 1, but here's what nobody tells you. Even if you stop doing the wrong things, you can still fail if you don't know how to actually read USMLE questions. In my next video, I'm breaking down the exact framework that turns a 220 or 230 into a 260 or even a 270. This includes the judge versus lawyer method, the context chronology severity framework, and the rule in before ruling out technique that prevents those painful unforced errors on questions that you know the answers to. If you want to stop leaving points on the table, be sure to check it out now. Now go fix your study approach and actually move that score.